of the Uncle Devin Show. Okay, thank you, Keisha. And I am Uncle Devin with the Uncle Devin Show. It's an interactive musical experience for children that uses drums and percussion to cultivate their minds, a dynamic cross between DC's Trouble Funk and Schoolhouse Rock. Been doing this for since 2012, and really exploring the role and the impact that music plays in a child's development. And through this, I do workshops, seminars, residencies. The areas I've primarily focused in has been early childhood, but certainly can stretch out in many different areas with that. And even prior to that, let me also share that I do have a long history of social activism and organizing. Starting in the 90s, grown up in the Black church, I actually began protesting in the Black church about the silence that I heard and saw in the wake of so many different things going on around the world. We were silent on the issues of war and militarism and of even what was going on in our communities. And so I started a movement there, led me to writing 2 books, appealing to the church and writing specific things that we can do to change that. And just that's just a beginning of going from the student movement to the adult movement, and now I'm organizing children through my music. So today we want to talk a little bit about the history of children's music, not children's music, the significant history of Easter Monday in the nation's capital, and we're going to give an overview of the history of Africans in DC. You're going to notice that I'm using the word Africans a lot, and I'm going to explain that in just a minute. We want to discuss the history of the Easter egg roll in Washington, D.C. And there is a history that's there. It's actually a funny history, and you'll see when we talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to share the history of Africans going to the National Zoo to celebrate Easter Monday. And then we will discuss the importance that Easter Monday has as a part of the community control movement, and I'll define that for you as we move forward. I am honored that this is connected with the Black Lives Matter guiding principles. And 2 of the principles that really focus, that I'm going to be focusing on, is one, their 10th principle, which is Black families. And we're committed to making our spaces family friendly and enables parents to fully participate with their children. We are committed to dismantling the patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work double shifts, that require them to mother in private, even as they participate in justice work. And then number 11, Black villages. We are committed to disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. So those are the 2 principles that I see aligned with this particular lesson. And I would like to start off with the history of what led to this whole process of Easter Monday. But we have to go back to chattel slavery. Many people have heard about chattel slavery, and I want to just kind of give an overview that we know that it existed for approximately 400 years and was outlawed in 1865. So we're talking about 400 years of free labor, of abusive treatment, of disrupting families. This is the process of making another human being a slave and the actual property of someone else who could be bought, sold, traded, or inherited. And they used every aspect of that they had to make this happen. It was by law, by government, by education, by business, by religion, history, and music. And today we're going to show how by government, the impact that this had on this particular celebration. And we also have to talk about this in the context of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. Was founded as a result of the Residence Act of July 16th, 1790. And it put the nation's capital in current day Washington as part of the plan to appease pro-slavery states who feared a northern capital as being too sympathetic to abolitionists. For those who may recognize and remember history, there was looked to make Philadelphia that capital, but they had to appeal to the pro-slavery states. And isn't it funny that you're going to hear me talk a lot about the fact that history is not an event, but a process. We're not looking at something that just happened. This is a continuation. And it's funny that even today, there's still those in government that have to negotiate and appease those who are anti-racist, those who are racist, those who want to go back to these old Jim Crow type of lifestyles in order to get policies done. History is not an event. It is a process. And so when we go back there, we have to first then understand that we were focusing on DC and the DC proper land that was compromised, where part of Virginia and Maryland gave up part of their land to create the district, and they did so on stolen land. And I would be remiss if I don't acknowledge the Anacostans, also documented as the Tank people, and the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. This was their land that was stolen from them. And all this is important history that leads us into what we're about to talk about, and particularly the fact that you had the Native Americans, but then you had Africans. If you hear me mention Africans, it's for very specific reasons. The history of this country, the history of capitalism, the history of all of this has been to try to disrupt and to disconnect the African people in North America from African people around the world, especially on the continent of Africa. The first people that came to this country, and when we first started our organizations, we all call them African. You had the African free slaves. You had the African Methodist Episcopal and African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. We saw and recognized that we were African. And so there may be times where people may use African American and Black, and I get that, and this is not a debate about that, but for my presentation, when I mention Africans, I may say Africans here in America versus Africans in the continent. But at this particular time in 1800, Africans were 25% of the population, and the majority were enslaved at that time. However, by 1830, most were free, but yet the system of slavery still existed. Remember, slavery did not end until 1865 officially. And so there was always a fight here. Everywhere there's oppression, there's always resistance, and that resistance movement led to a number of different things, which included the Dc Emancipation Act of 1862. And this was on April 16th, where Congress passed the District of Columbia Emancipation Act. It made Washingtonians the first freed Africans, I should have said, in the nation, 9 months before Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And so ultimately, we saw that from this particular time period, from 1861 to 1877, more than 25,000 Africans moved to Washington, D.C. Many migrating from the South out of the Confederate States into Washington, D.C. at the time. And by that time, and it's so much so that by 1900, Washington had the largest percentage of Africans of any city in the nation. And so just want to give that backdrop. And as I'm giving that backdrop, and again, we're about to talk about Easter Monday, but we have to understand something very significant. While this change was taking place, the social milieu in this country still viewed Africans as less than human. And I'm a children's music artist, and I do a workshop entitled Racism in Children's Music. And is nowhere else is it clear shown how this hatred toward Blacks were than when you looked at children's music, which created the ideas that led to the discrimination that we saw moving forward. So, for example, let me just give 2 or 3 quick examples of what I mean. Many of you may have heard the song called "A Tisket, a Tasket." A tisket, a tasket, I lost my yellow basket. That particular song, I used to sing it before I knew the history of it. And if you look at the lyrics here, and I'll just sing the other part. A tisket, a tasket, a green and yellow basket. I sent a letter to my love, and on the way I dropped it. I dropped it. I dropped it. Yes, on the way, I dropped it. A little. Now, I used to think that the only word was a little girly picked it up, but the real term was a little darky picked it up and put it in his pocket. This would just go to show that part of the racism and the bias was implanted in education on many educational levels, that helped to create this type of climate that we're about to go into and that we're about to discuss. Black children in particular, because of this racism, were viewed as pickaninnies, as coons, as animals. Again, we're talking about Easter Monday, which was geared toward children. I want to help you to understand the history and the psychology of what was going on in the country at this time. A pickaninny, according to the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, says that the dominant racial character of Black children for most of this country's history. It didn't say some, it said most of this history. They were child coons, miniature versions of step and fetching. I can do a whole session on step and fetching, which I do in my other class, but you have to look step and fetching up. He was the first Black Hollywood success story that played a buffoon, a Black person as a buffoon. And there's debates on whether or not he was positive or negative. Pickaninnies had bulging eyes, unkept hair, red lips, and wide mouths into which they stuffed huge slices of watermelon. We can go all the way through this definition, but I want you to understand that these were the popular definitions of how people viewed Africans, especially African children. And it permeated itself in culture, in advertisement. These were advertisements and books that were used. And I'm just sharing a few with you. We were also viewed as bait for alligators. Many of you all may have heard of that, but there's this whole thing of alligator bait. Walt Disney got into the action and had this thing called Tar Baby. Little Africans, and again, we're talking about starting in the 1800s and all the way up to almost about the really 1970s. But you still see a lot of this going on today. But it was extremely a major part of culture around the time that we're talking. And let me just leave one last thing with you. Some of the most popular Mother Goose songs and rhymes would come out of this complete melodies called Mother Goose. In 1697, Charles Perrault published a collection of folk tales with this subtitle, Tales from My Mother Goose. And Mother Goose may have been evolved over centuries, but this book was published in 1892. And I just want to share with you now the only reference to Africans in this book was one particular song that I'm sure many of you have sung before. I took out some of it so you won't see it, but it's 10 Little Ends. And this is actually published in the book that you can probably find in your library right now. I found this right online. So I'm painting this picture so that now we can get into Easter Monday, because it was this history that developed the psychology of what we're speaking of. Let's look at Easter Monday celebrations. Now, first of all, it's ironic that we're talking about Easter Monday, especially, and I'm talking about Africa, because Easter actually has its origins in Mother Africa. Easter Monday was celebrated thousands of years before the birth of Jesus, and many people don't realize that. And have you ever asked yourself the question why Easter falls on a different day and sometimes on a different month each year? Now, I didn't know you can get killed on a different day, let alone a different month, but somehow we figured that one out. Well, quite honestly, the holiday was borrowed by other cultures and adopted. And again, I'm not saying anything negative about how people practice that, but just letting you know a little bit of history, that Easter had nothing to do at that time. Well, in ancient Africa, they celebrated as an astrological holiday and related to their crops. And Easter is nothing more than the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. That's why that day changes every year. And it's based upon the calendar. Now, So that's just a little history I thought I'd put in there since I had mentioned a little bit about Africa, because it's ironic that an African holiday by origin is being denied to people of African descent thousands upon thousands of years later. But we can go and now talk a little bit about Easter Monday. And let me go to the chat, make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. So let's go to Easter Monday. Easter Monday, did I do the same thing? Okay. So one of the things about Easter Monday and why Easter Monday is significant was that in DC, whether they were free, whether Africans were free or Africans were enslaved, they still were servants and they had to work on Easter. So Easter Monday was the day that traditionally most of the owners or most of those that did the hiring would let their servants off. So Easter Monday really became a very significant day for families to get together. It was a very important time where we connected and had time to ourselves. And so the first White House Easter egg roll took place in 1876. And upwards to 10,000 children went to the U.S. Capitol to participate in this tradition of rolling hard-boiled eggs down the hill to see which one traveled the furthest. That was actually the history of the Easter egg roll. It was a contest. It was, kids make up games all the time. And so many of these children, I believe they were majority white, but I haven't confirmed that, but I believe that they were. They went to the U.S. Capitol. And they have, if you ever go back and look at the history, folks in Congress went crazy because not only, you're talking about 10,000 children, they made so much noise and it was just bouncing off the hollow shell of the Capitol that they had to put a stop to it. So in 1876, Congress passed the turf protection law because they were saying that all those 10,000 kids just was trampling over the grass and left debris everywhere. And Congress really didn't have a lot of money at that particular time. There were so many other things that were going on, so that they decided to forbid people from coming down to there in 1876. So much so that when people attempted to do it some years later, they called the police out and made sure that no one was able to come down there. But this law was passed again by President Ulysses Grant in 1876. The very next year, in 1877, it rained. So there was no Easter egg roll because the weather did not permit an Easter egg roll. Well, a new election came and we have a new president. Rutherford B. Hayes became the president. And in 1878, he instructed his guards to allow this popular pastime to continue. But he did not allow blacks to come. This was the law. And I wanted to give that history prior to that so that we can understand that it really wasn't anything that was unheard of at that time. This was the lay of the land. Blackface was the main popular form of entertainment at that time. And so we have the very first White House Easter egg roll in 1878. And there have been, for the most part, they've had Easter egg rolls moving forward since then. Some have been canceled for different reasons. At times, because of food rationing, they had to say that, look, we cannot afford to just be wasting food at an event like that, so they would cancel it. Sometimes because of wars, they said it wasn't the right time and it was a security risk to have that many people on the property. But for the most part, since 1878, there has been different aspects of the Easter egg roll. And what I'll share with you, and I just have some footage that I'll share with you. That there's no sound on this particular video, but just to give you an understanding. Now, this was in 1921, and I didn't know that you can get this many people on the White House grounds. But I was talking with Keisha prior to this, and she reminded me that this was, of course, before they put the gates up around the White House. And I was like, that's absolutely correct. So perhaps a lot of this could be in front of the White House, in Lafayette Square, etc. But I just want to show you a little bit of footage of people on the White House lawn. You may not see a lot of Blacks at the White House at this time. I don't know if the segregation was still at play in 1921. I did see some video footage, but I couldn't. I didn't have the rights to share it, where you saw some Blacks at the White House around the 19 teens and the 1920s. But it was just very interesting to see how I think that's George Philip Sousa, and that they brought out to actually conduct and just have so many people out there, and wait till you see the number of children. They're throwing eggs and eating eggs and having so much fun out there. But this was on the White House, and was visibly not present are a lot of Black children and families, and that's why that principle for Black Lives Matter is so important, because why eggs and not something like rocks? So I'm sorry, somebody sent me a private message. That's funny. And I know that the whole thing about Easter eggs and all, depending on who you talk to, some say that's, has something to do with Easter and doesn't have anything to do with Easter, but nonetheless, it's part of that Easter tradition. And I just wanted to share with you a little bit of this footage of, and you can just look how much trash is out there. And Congress said that at the time when they first did it, they just could not even afford to pay people to really come and clean the grass. I mean, the grass up, and it just destroyed the lawn there. So that's why it ended up coming over to the White House. And so this led to about 2 decades later, in 1891, we ended up going to I'm sorry, I should have been showing this as a slideshow. I wasn't even thinking. Leading to the National Zoo for the Easter egg roll. And this is a picture that I found at the Library of Congress of Blacks at the National Zoo. It has been very difficult to find much footage. I'm still doing some research of this, but what the National Zoo, when they open up their doors, I don't know if they knew that it would be so welcoming and so, I guess the people would really take to it, that this thing grew tremendously. And to the extent that it started in 1891, but it became so popular that I should say 55,000 people attended in 1910. 55,000 people at the National Zoo. And this then began this particular history, that took place. And what was most important about this was, yes, the White House said that they would discriminate. That Blacks were not allowed. Well, even within those 20 years prior to that, the Black community were having their own celebrations. But now when the National Zoo opened up, it was a place that was large enough for the entire community and the entire village to come out. And people started coming out in droves. And that began what I consider the most unofficial holiday in the District of Columbia. And this is why I think that day is still so important for us to recognize. In DC government, I don't believe that they recognize that this date as a holiday. They may give it the students the day off, but I think teachers have an in-service or something to that degree. But I think that's an error. I think it's important for us to continue to recognize this particular day, because it's more than just about Easter Monday. Regardless of what your religious background is or anything to that degree, this particular day became a day of resistance. It became a day where we said, well, we're not going to focus on your discrimination. We're going to focus on our self-determination. And you began seeing that in so many different fashions. And particularly, you got to understand that this was happening right during the time of 2 of the most important movements in the history of African people. The Marcus Garvey movement, Marcus Garvey, of course, coming out of Jamaica, but leading a huge movement with the Universal Negro Improvement Association. and then the first Pan-African Congress led by people like W.E.B. Du Bois on the right, and others that were now organizing, and both were organizing for self-determination. And so in the midst of all of this, Africans in DC, and many who were part of both of these movements, began to organize and say, well, look, we will do our own thing. That is extremely important. This is about community control. It's about us having self-determination. And that's why this particular aspect of things is very, very important. And so this lasted for over hundreds of years. Again, I'm still pulling together footage. There are many different articles that are out here about the National Zoo activities for Easter Monday. But one thing that happened in the 1910s, that's when we began seeing a lot of violence that took place as a result of it just being a very popular event. People knew that they would know someone there. And here was an article that was published by NBC4 News back in 2015. And they documented a history of violence that started taking place at the National Zoo. Now, everybody here can identify with the fact that at different times there's going to be violence that takes place, not even violence, things that take place that are outside of your control. That's just part of it. But for some reason, those here in the district decided to get rid of this entire holiday instead of focusing on the very root of the problem. And that is violence in a nation that is, as Dr. King said in 1967, is the #1 purveyor of violence in the world. But yet, when there's violence in other places and in other communities, they don't just shut down that program altogether. They organize and they make sure that it's safe so that people can continue to go. But for some reason, that didn't happen here until now. We're now organizing a movement so that we can make sure that we recognize our history, honor those that had led this particular history, and we can protect our babies ourselves. This is not about the police. This is about us. If we do what we're supposed to do, we won't even need the police. And I always point to the Million Man March. And those who remember the Million Man March, we had 1 million people here in the city. And I don't think that there was one person arrested that day. We know that we can do it. But here you'll see that there were a number of people that were, a number of different incidences that occurred on this particular day. And that's our responsibility to be able to change. And so I'll come back to this in just a minute. I'm gonna stop sharing for just 1 second. But the most important thing about this particular history goes back to the fact that it's something that we recognizing the fact that there were those who sought to continue to oppress us, those that continue to say that, okay, well, look, blacks weren't allowed here. We did it ourselves. And so part of what I've done in connecting this to, we were talking about how they had different laws. It's beautiful that now DC go-go music is the official music of Washington, DC. That's very significant because now I've taken this opportunity to create a song using our indigenous music to highlight this particular history and to build a movement around why this is important for us, not even just from a holiday standpoint. Whether you celebrate or not is not the most important thing, but the most important thing is understanding this history and how we can use it as a form of continued resistance. I'm going to share with you a video that I did that was a children's song, part of a compilation album that I will talk about in just a moment. This particular video, let me see, optimize, if it allows me to do it. Here we
go. Now check it out. In 1878, the White House had an Easter egg roll. It's an annual event to celebrate the holiday, but blacks weren't allowed to go. Instead of being sad, we all got together and went to the National Zoo. For For over 100 years in the nation's capital, families went there with their crew. Now get funky with it. You said we can come with you to have some fun. This is what we say. Sing it. We made the best of your segregation and turned it into a DC holiday. On Easter Monday, at the National Zoo, it's a fun day for me and you in Chocolate City. All day, come join the party. Ashe, in the spirit of family. Yes, it is. And in unity. That's right. Let's get rockin' to the beat. Have you seen any eggs? Where they at? Where they at? Have you seen any pandas? Where they at? Where they at? Have you seen any tigers? Where they at? Where they at? Have you seen all the people? Where they at? Where they at? You can't keep us down or stop our go-go sound. Hashtag don't UDC. Loving that beat, moving your feet. Come on. We'll come together as one to learn and have some fun. Come join us and you'll see. On Easter Monday, the National Zoo, it's a fun day for me and you in Chocolate City. All day, come join the party. Ashe, in the spirit of family. Yes, it is. And in unity. That's right. Let's get rockin' to the beat. You know it. The beat is sockin' and the people are rockin' to the beat. And the young and old together everywhere, just moving their feet. And the moral of the story is that we must do for self. And the best way to start is through love and knowledge of self. Now let's move. Special dedication going out to all the children in Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, and Southwest Washington, D.C. Also all the children in Sea Pleasant and Bryan's Road. I'm so glad you showed. And children everywhere. A shout out to Mother Africa. You know we love you. So let's do it! On Easter Monday, at the National Zoo, it's a fun day for me and you in Chocolate City. All day, come join the party. Ashe, in the spirit of family. Yes, it is. And in unity. That's what I'm talking about. Let's get rockin' to the beat. Here we go. Having fun. Uncle Devin on the one.
So that song I wrote for two reasons. That song is part of two different albums. The first is an album called All One Tribe. And when we speak about the Black Lives Matter principles about putting everything together for families, that's why this is so important. That particular album, there were 24 Black family children artists that came together to do a CD in the spirit of, actually we came together after the murder of George Floyd. And we wanted our children to see themselves reflected in family music and in children's music. That was the song that I submitted, and others submitted about 23 other songs. And we are so honored, though. Let me go back to my presentation here, and then I'll wrap up and we open up for some questions. Let me see, what did I do with it here? Is this it? Nope, that's not it. We'll go back to my presentation, and then we'll open up for questions if I can find where is my presentation. But nonetheless, while I pull that back up, that particular album that we did, we just found out last week that we've been nominated for a Grammy for Best Children's Album. And we're going to be going out to California in January to see if we can bring home the Grammy. It's such an honor to be connected with such a project, and we had no idea that would even be an option. But the fact that we all pulled this together for this particular purpose, and I don't need to go back to the PowerPoint presentation, is just great. But what we also going to be doing is using this music, using this history, working with teachers, working with others to revitalize our history. and to use it as a tool to mobilize, using the indigenous music, but using our history of coming together to take a negative and turn it into a positive. That's what we have a historical responsibility to do. And that's why I felt that it was important for me to be able to share this with as many educators as possible, because you can also use this as an opportunity to mobilize children and connect them to history, not as an event, but history as a process.